Welcome back to U.S. history. We were talking about the American idols of the 1920s, and we got as far as Knute Rockne, who was known as a popular college football coach for Notre Dame. Continuing on, talking about some of these individuals, another well-known star was a guy by the name of Bobby Jones. He became known as the King of Golf back in the 1920s. William Tilden, he led in the sport of tennis. As ordinary people took note of the victories of these athlete idols, golf courses and tennis courts multiplied across the land, popularized by these people. Hollywood stars, people like Charlie Chaplin and others, became popular as silent films, and then sound movies were shown on the big screens. During the 1920s, it had become obvious that Americans were addicted to Hollywood and knowing what their stars were doing on and off the screen. Number 2, Pride and Prejudice. No, we're not talking about the book, but rather talking about the real issues of Pride and Prejudice. We see during this time a growth of diversity and discrimination in America. Not all things were good in the Roaring '20s. By the beginning of the 20th century, the population became more diverse. From 1900 to 1910, nearly 10 million immigrants came to America, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Most were Catholics or Jews. Many were poor and uneducated. Many middle-class Protestant Americans felt threatened by this. Probably the climax, or maybe the best example of the Pride and Prejudice that took place during the 1920s involved the Sacco-Vanzetti case. Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested in connection with a robbery and murder of two people. The case gained mounting publicity as the defense argued that they were being tried because they were Italian-born and anarchists, not because they had actually committed the crime. Well, end result was they were convicted and executed, although the evidence given against them was doubtful at best. Still, they're not sure if these men were actually guilty or not. A law that was created during this time was called the National Origins Act, which set quotas to restrict immigration. It limited immigration of a nationality to 2% of that nationality in the U.S. as of 1890. It also prohibited any Japanese immigration as well. Clearly, the government wanted to preserve America from a threat to its Anglo-Saxon heritage. We also see the growth of the black population in the northern cities. With the drop in immigrant workers, industrial cities needed to get their workers from somewhere else. From 1910 to 1930, 1 million blacks moved from the south to northern cities to find work. Some went into politics. Some, like Louis Armstrong, went into musical entertainment. In fact, jazz music soon gained popularity among blacks and white audiences. We also see the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Some Americans reacted violently to the new social changes. The KKK promoted what they called 100% Americanism, opposing Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and blacks. It gained huge support in the South and some Midwest states. The secret organization had several million members in the mid-1920s before declining again in popularity. In your books, turn please to page 455. There's a yellow box entitled Scarface about Al Capone. Please read that box to yourself, and then when you're finished, please unpause and resume the video. Letter D. Fighting for the faith. Number 1, we see the rise of fundamentalism. After the horrors of World War I, a new group emerged called premillennialists. Unlike the progressive postmillennialists who thought the world was getting better and better, premillennialism believes that the world is getting worse and worse, and that Christ can come at any time to set up his kingdom. Those who hold to the fundamental doctrines of Christianity were called fundamentalists. These fundamental doctrines are beliefs that no one can deny and still claim to be Christians. They include doctrines such as the authority of Scripture, Christ's deity, and his death, burial, and resurrection, which has paid the penalty for our sin. In 1920, a Christian editor wrote, "We suggest that those who still cling to the great fundamentals and who mean to do battle royal for the fundamentals be called fundamentalists." Let's see the fight. Number 2, the fundamentalist modernist controversy. This primarily involved the fight over the major denominations, churches, and missions boards in America. Many conservatives were not willing to expel modernists from their denominations if such action risked a major split. Many fundamentalists formed new denominations like the General Association of Regular Baptists, as well as the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. William Bell Riley had fought to retain control of the Northern Baptist Convention, which had gone liberal. Seeing it was hopeless to fix the denomination, he formed a new Baptist denomination. J. Gresham Machen was a teacher at Princeton. He wrote a book called Christianity and Liberalism and forcefully pointed out that modernism was not Christianity, but another religion entirely. When Princeton went liberal during the 1920s, Machen left and began the Orthodox Presbyterian Church denomination. Probably the event that caused the most controversy had to do with creationism versus evolutionism. In 1925, we have what is referred to as the Scopes Monkey Trial. In the South, where Christianity was stronger, some states had even passed laws that banned the teaching of evolution in the public schools. My, how much time has changed. In Dayton, Tennessee, some city leaders persuaded a science teacher to break the law. The reason was as a publicity stunt to put them on the map. That teacher was a man by the name of John T. Scopes. He was a teacher who taught evolution in the school, and he was charged and brought to trial for it. His defense attorney was a man by the name of Clarence Darrow. Darrow was Scopes' defense attorney. He's the man pictured on your left in the picture. As an agnostic, he did all he could to insult Christianity. The man pictured on his right, who we've talked about before in the past, was William Jennings Bryan. He was on the prosecutor's staff. He was called on to defend the biblical story. Although Bryan showed commendable courage in his defense of the faith, unfortunately for him and his defense, he was no Bible scholar. In the end, Scopes was convicted. He had broken the law. But Bryan and the anti-evolutionists had lost the publicity battle. In fact, Bryan himself would die just a few days after the trial was over. In your books, turn to page 457 and read that box about Bryan. He kept the faith to yourself. After reading that box, you must agree with what Bryan said about himself to some listeners. He said, "You may dispute over whether I have fought a good fight. You may dispute over whether I have finished my course, but you cannot deny that I have kept the faith." May we, as Christians, also seek to keep the faith of the Bible. Number 4, there were some fundamentalist success as well. Although Bryan had died and the American culture had grown increasingly anti-Christian, fundamentalism continued to experience some success in the 1920s. We see the growth of Bible colleges, of Bible seminaries, and Bible radio stations. By 1930, more than 50 Bible colleges and seminaries offered training for those who could no longer trust their denominational colleges and seminaries. In 1932, there were over 400 evangelical programs on 80 different radio stations in the country. Also, during this time, we see that the mainline denominations, the liberal denominations, will suffer a decline. Apparently, going to church for the sake of going to church and having no true biblical view in it doesn't help, and people left the mainline denominations. But fundamentalist institutions prospered. On page 417 in your activities book, we're not going to do this in class, nor am I assigning it as homework, but it gives you some views on the it says positive or negative influence. Write a brief description of each of the following 1920s personalities and detail each man's influence on 1920s society. So were they a positive influence or a negative influence on society? Well, it's up for opinion. Some of them are more obvious than others. For example, you got Al Capone. Obviously, you could see him as a negative influence for all the things he did, leader of illegal crimes, murder of many people, the crime ring in Chicago. You could talk about obvious positives like William Jennings Bryan. He pushed for the ban of teaching evolution, and he was involved with the Scopes trial. He showed courage in his defense of the faith. We can mention men like Charles Lindbergh, first solo non-stop flight across the Atlantic. He was a positive influence during the 1920s. Albert Einstein, German scientist whose theory of relativity was inaccurately used by many writers and philosophers to discredit scriptural and moral standards. And then Sigmund Freud, an Austrian psychologist who believed that many of man's problems are caused in some way by sex. Therefore, man should reject inhibitions and express himself. Freud influenced people to disdain moral and ethical restraints. He advocated the use of psychoanalysis rather than religion to solve man's problems, replacing the minister with the psychiatrist. He was decidedly a negative influence on life in the 1920s and afterward. For your homework, remember you guys got these packets on Monday. You're responsible for completing the packets before you're coming back in at the end of the week to pick up the next week packets. Please make sure that you have all of this done. The quiz that I'm assigning is a quiz over pages 450 to 457. Hope you do well on that. Have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.